The Russian Revolution of 1917 was one of the most significant political events of the 20th century, leading to the establishment of a communist government in Russia and profoundly influencing global history. The revolution unfolded through a series of tumultuous events, marked by convergence of social unrest, economic hardship, military failures, and the eventual collapse of the centuries-old Romanov dynasty. To understand how these events unfolded, it is essential to examine the broader context of Russian society and politics in the early 20th century, the critical developments of 1917, and the eventual rise of the Bolsheviks to power. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia was an empire plagued by deep social and economic divisions. The vast majority of the population were peasants, living in poverty and working under harsh conditions on land owned by a small elite. The country's economy was primarily agrarian, with industrialization confined to a few cities. The industrial working class, though relatively small, was growing and becoming increasingly discontented with their conditions. The autocratic rule of the Tsar, which allowed no political freedoms or avenues for expression of dissent, further exacerbated the tensions in Russian society. The Russian monarchy under Tsar Nicholas II was increasingly seen as out of touch with the needs and aspirations of the people. The catalyst for the revolution came during World War I. Russia's involvement in the war was disastrous. The country was ill-prepared for the demands of a prolonged conflict, and its military suffered devastating defeats at the hands of the Germans. The war effort strained Russia's economy to the breaking point. Food shortages became widespread, inflation soared, and the transportation system was on the brink of collapse. The war also brought immense suffering to the Russian people, with millions of soldiers killed or wounded, and the civilian population enduring severe hardships. By early 1917, the situation in Russia had reached a critical point. Discontent was growing among the working class, the peasants, and even the soldiers, many of whom were deserting the front lines. The Tsar's authority was rapidly eroding, and there were increasing calls for change. On the 23rd of February 1917, Julian calendar, March 8th in the Gregorian calendar, International Women's Day, a mass protest broke out in Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia. The protest was initially sparked by women workers demanding bread, but quickly grew into a massive demonstration against the government, drawing in workers from various industries and eventually leading to a general strike. The situation escalated rapidly over the next few days. As more workers joined the protests, the demonstrations became increasingly political. Slogans like "Down with the Tsar" and "In the War" began to be heard. The government, unable to control the situation, ordered the police and military to suppress the protests. However, this order backfired. Many soldiers, who were themselves disillusioned with the war and the government, refused to fire on the protesters and instead joined them. The mutiny of the soldiers was a crucial turning point, as it signaled the collapse of the government's ability to maintain order. On March 2, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II, under immense pressure from his generals, political leaders, and even members of his own family, abdicated the throne, bringing an end to more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The abdication of the Tsar marked the victory of the February Revolution, as it came to be known. In the immediate aftermath, a provisional government was established, composed mainly of members of the Duma, the Russian parliament. This government was intended to serve as a temporary authority until a constituent assembly could be elected to determine Russia's future. The fall of the Tsar and the establishment of the provisional government, however, did not bring stability to Russia. The provisional government was weak and faced significant challenges from the start. It had to contend with the ongoing war, the demands of the working class and peasants for land reform and better working conditions, and the rise of radical political movements, most notably the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, a Marxist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, were committed to the overthrow of the provisional government and the establishment of a socialist state. The period between the February Revolution and the Bolshevik seizure of power in October was one of dual power in Russia. On the one hand, the provisional government sought to maintain its authority and continue the war effort, despite its unpopularity. On the other hand, the Soviets, workers' councils that had emerged during the revolution, represented the interests of the working class and increasingly challenged the provisional government's authority. The Petrograd Soviet, in particular, became a powerful force, issuing orders that often conflicted with those of the provisional government. The summer of 1917 saw a series of crises that further weakened the provisional government. The most significant of these was the July Days, a spontaneous uprising by soldiers, sailors, and workers in Petrograd, who were frustrated with the government's inability to address their demands. Although the uprising was suppressed, it exposed the growing discontent and the government's inability to control the situation. The Bolsheviks, who initially hesitated to support the uprising, gained significant support in its aftermath, as they were seen as the only political group capable of bringing about the radical change that many desired. Meanwhile, Lenin, who had returned to Russia from exile in April 1917 with the help of the Germans, who hoped his return would further destabilize Russia, was advocating for a second revolution. In his April theses, Lenin called for the overthrow of the provisional government and the transfer of power to the Soviets. His slogans of peace, land and bread, and all power to the Soviets resonated with the war-weary soldiers, the land-hungry peasants, and the urban workers who were struggling to survive in the face of economic collapse. By the autumn of 1917, the provisional government was in a desperate situation. The war was going badly, the economy was in ruins, and the Bolsheviks were gaining more and more support. The situation reached a climax in October, when the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, decided that the time was ripe for a second revolution. On October 25, 1917, Julian calendar, November 7th in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks, with the support of the Petrograd Soviet and the Red Guards, armed workers and soldiers, launched the coup against the provisional government. The coup, later known as the October Revolution, was relatively bloodless. The Bolsheviks seized key government buildings, the telegraph office, and the railway stations in Petrograd. The provisional government, which was meeting in the Winter Palace, was arrested with little resistance. By the morning of October 26th, the Bolsheviks were in control of Petrograd, and Lenin announced the establishment of a new government, the Council of People's Commissars, with himself as the head. The Bolsheviks had successfully overthrown the provisional government and seized power. The October Revolution marked the beginning of a new era in Russian history. The Bolsheviks, who would later rename themselves the Communist Party, set about consolidating their power and implementing their radical socialist agenda. One of their first acts was to withdraw Russia from World War I, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, which ceded large portions of Russian territory to the Central Powers. This decision was controversial and contributed to the outbreak of the Russian Civil War, as various anti-Bolshevik forces, collectively known as the Whites, sought to overthrow the new regime. The Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1918 to 1922, was a brutal and complex conflict, with multiple factions fighting for control of Russia. The Bolsheviks, despite facing numerous challenges, including foreign intervention, eventually emerged victorious. Their victory ensured the survival of the communist government and the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922. The events of 1917, culminating in the Bolshevik Revolution, had a profound impact not only on Russia but also on the world, inspiring communist movements globally and leading to the establishment of a state that would play a central role in 20th century geopolitics. The Russian Revolution of 1917 unfolded as a complex and multifaceted process, driven by a combination of long-standing social and economic grievances, the disastrous effects of World War I, and the determined efforts of the Bolsheviks to seize power. The collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the failure of the provisional government, and the rise of the Bolsheviks marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, as Russia embarked on a radical experiment in socialist governance that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire world.